Welcome to another video where we're going to take a look at creating a governance application powered by SubQuery. The aim of this lesson is to build an example project to index all the votes of council members on the Substrate blockchain for a given motion. The screenshot below here is taken from subscan.io, and you can scan the QR code to navigate directly to this particular block, which is just over 7 million. And here you can see we've got account ID, which is actually the proposer, a proposer index of 114, which is actually the council motion number, more on this later, and the hash, and also the member count. Now, the actual end goal is that we want to be able to write a GraphQL query, as you can see on the left hand side here, to retrieve the same data from our indexing project as you see from the Explorer on the right hand side. The block here matches just over 7 million as mentioned. We've got the proposer, which we've called in our project, but this equates to the account ID 1HCM. We've got the hash 0xE2, which matches on the Explorer, and also the member count of 8, which we've labeled as the vote threshold. And you can see why we are renaming these when we start building the project. There are just 4 steps involved in creating this project. The very first one is to run the SubQuery init command, which creates a scaffold so you don't have to start from scratch. You get a project pre-populated with files and folders and sample code that you modify. Speaking of modification, the first file to change is the schema.graphql file. This file defines the shape or the type of information you want to extract. Next, we want to modify the manifest file, also known as the project.yaml file. And this is essentially a configuration file where you define filters and start blocks, etc. The last step in the process here is to modify the mapping handler file, and this is where the actual coding and transformation of the indexing takes place. This is just a link to the GitHub repository for the complete code provided as reference as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we want to do is initialize our project. And we can do this by running the SubQuery init command and then providing a name for our starter project, such as Councillor Proposal. We'll then choose the Substrate network family and then scroll down to the Polkadot network. Select the starter project and then we'll accept all the default parameters here. And now we've got the Councillor scaffolding project ready to start. Now the first thing I usually do is let's install all the dependencies first of all. There we go. Then what I generally like to do is go ahead and just give this a test run by running code gen. And then I'm going to build the project. And then I've got Docker running already, so let's start this in Docker as well. And you can see here I've got Docker running in the background. And I've got the images downloading. And very shortly we should be able to run a test query. There we go, we've got the indexing started. Let's go ahead and open our playground at localhost 3000. We've got the standard query here and let's hit run. And you can see we are returning blocks. So this is really good news. Let's go ahead and stop this project. I'll go ahead and also delete the database here. And we'll kick things off by starting with the schema file. Now remember that this defines the shape of our data, so to speak. So what data do we want to pull out? Well, let me just copy the code in here first of all, because just to save a bit of time, I'll define what I want to extract already. The first one is the proposal, and I want to grab the index, the proposer, the hash, and the vote threshold, etc. Also the vote history, and then the counselor as well. So these three entities effectively replicate this database table here. We've got our vote history, which has a proposal hash, which is linked to the proposal table, allowing us to extract the person who proposed this particular motion, the vote threshold, and also the block number as well. And then we've got the counselor, where we can derive the number of votes. So you might be wondering, how do I know what fields I can actually extract? This is all in the documentation, and you can also see this in the Explorer as well. So once this has been defined, the next step is to open the manifest file, and then what we'll do is scroll down. You can see we've got reference to the chain ID, the endpoint, the dictionary. I'm going to change the start block from 1 to 7 million, just so we're not indexing from the Genesis block, because it could take a lot of time. And then down below, I've got my handlers. I've got the block, event, and the call. I don't need the call, so let's remove this. And I don't want to use the block either, so let's delete that. And I've got this handle event. Now, the name handle event, I can change to anything that I want. So let's change this to council proposed event. And the module that I want to use is actually called council. And the method will be proposed. And you might be wondering, well, how do I know this? Well, if you go to polkadot.subscan.io in the blockchain dropdown, selecting events, you can see the modules available. So down here, we've got the council module. And inside here, we've got the proposed and the voted event. And of course, we can extract more if we wanted to. So this is where you can find out all the various modules and the events available to you. Let me go ahead and add a second handler. I'll copy this like so. Just a note that the tab and the spacing is very important. And then I'm going to call this one handle council voted event. And my method is going to be voted in this case. Okay, so I've saved that. Let's now jump into our mapping handler file. And this is where a lot of the coding takes place. First of all, remember how I removed the handle block filter. So let's delete the associated function and also the call handler as well. So we don't need these. And I'll go ahead and delete the body of the handle event, because the first thing I want to do is change the name to what we had before in our manifest file, which was handle council proposed event. And I'm just going to copy a whole bunch of code here just to save a bit of time so you don't have to see me typing. And all of this code is available in our GitHub repository. Here I'm going to declare a variable called event, where I'm extracting the payload event of type substrate event. And from the documentation, I know that this is the data payload that I can extract. From here, I go ahead and instantiate a new instance of proposal, putting it into a constant called proposal, and then I'm extracting the various parameters and placing it into my proposal object. And at the end here, I just save it. The second function that I want to create is called the handle council voted event. And again, this maps to our handler here, handle council voted event. And basically, whenever there is a match to the council module and the voted method, this handler will be triggered. This piece of code will then execute, again passing through the event. And from the documentation, I know the data payload coming out, so I go ahead and start my extraction. Now I've got a little helper function here to ensure that the counselor is valid. I'll come back to this in a second, but assuming that it is, I go ahead and create a new instance of vote history, providing the default constructor of a unique identifier consisting of the block number as well as the event ID. And then just like above, I go ahead and grab the various parameters and assigning it to my vote history object. Now, the helper function I talked about here, this is just to ensure that if counselor is not empty, I create a new counselor object, and then I set the number of votes to 0, effectively resetting it. Otherwise, I increment the number of votes. Now let's just tidy the code up a bit. I don't have extrinsics or blocks to import, so let's delete these. There's a few other things I need to change, but before I do, let's go ahead and run yarn code gen to generate the objects from our schema file. And then I'm going to build it, and we'll see the errors that return. Okay, so you can see here that we don't have our starter entity object to import, and that is correct because we've deleted it. In fact, we've got proposal, we've got counselor, and we've got vote history. And these three, remember, they come from the schema file: proposal, vote history, and counselor. I don't have balance, so let's delete this, save it and run it again. I get another error where it cannot find the name Boolean. So what I need to do is actually import not just Boolean but integer from the Polkadot types. So let's save this and build it again. And there we have it. Now, before we run this in Docker, I'm just going to delete the old container. And then I'll run start Docker. You don't have to, but I do like to start again from a clean instance. And now that this is up and running, let's give it a couple of seconds before we give it a test. Okay, so it looks like it's indexing. Let's now jump to our playground. And what I'll do is I'm going to copy this query in here. It's basically looking at the proposals entity or table and extracting the various parameters like so. And there we have it. We've got the block number, the proposer, the hash, and the vote threshold as well. So if you want to know where this came from, you can also use the documentation here, where if you go query and then you go to the proposals and then go to nodes, then you can enter in the various parameters here in order to extract the data. So that's proposal, and remember that this was the table here. Let's do the same for vote history and counselor and see what gets returned. For counselor, it's very simple. We've just got the number of votes. So run this, and that's returning successfully. And let's go for vote history. Run this, and the data is indeed coming back. So this is working really well. But the power of this project is being able to query across the entities. Next up, let's go ahead and inspect a particular block. So I've got this query here where I'm running a filtering on block 7042001. I'll run this. And I want to pull this up in Explorer as well. So down below here, what I want to show you is if I scroll down in the Events tab, you'll see that I've got this Council Proposed event. And if I expand it, you'll see I've got the account ID as 1HCMD, which is the proposer as I've labeled up above. We've got the likes of the hash, which matches, E2B, so E2B, and also the member count or the vote threshold. Now, what I want to show you is if I click on the proposal index of 114, this really is the council motion number. And the topic is where Clever Mobile Wallet wanted the inclusion of Polkadot for milestone 1 and 2. So it's effectively a proposal here. And scrolling down, you can see some voting details. You can see the timeline. And inside the post, this is the actual proposal itself. So just to provide some perspective on what the various council members are actually voting on, what I want to do next is let's create a filter across different entities, such as the following. Here I've got councillors, And we saw before, we grabbed the number of votes, but we can also grab the vote histories of these particular councillors. So if I run this, you can see I've got the ID of the councillor, 32 votes in this case, and then you can see the various nodes down below. And of course, I could pull out more data if required. And you might be thinking, well, there's 32 here, but I've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why is that? That is because I've got a filter called first 5. If I remove this, you'll see that it will indeed go ahead to 40, and it will show all 40. So I could actually remove this and just display the total count. So there you have it, a very quick example of how to create a SubQuery project, grabbing vote history, vote count, proposers from the Substrate blockchain. Let's jump into the summary now, where we went ahead and ran subql init to start the project. We then modified the schema.graphql file, creating 3 entities that you saw: proposals, vote history, and councillor. We modified the start block to 7 million, filtered on the council module and the proposed and voted method. We then created 3 mapping handlers: the council proposed events, council voted event, and a helper function called ensure councillor. So there you have it. I hope it was useful, and I'll see you on the next video.